Chapter 16. What happened about the statues? What an extraordinary place, cried Lucy. All those stone animals and people too. It's like a museum. Hush, said Susan. Aslan's doing something. He was indeed, as he bounded up to the stone lion and breathed on him. Then, without waiting a moment, he whisked around almost as if he had been a cat chasing his tail, and breathed also on a stone dwarf, which, as you remember, was standing a few feet from the lion with his back to it. Then he pounced on a tall stone dryad, which stood beyond the dwarf, turning rapidly aside to deal with a stone rabbit on his right, and rushed to two centaurs. But at that moment, Lucy said, "Oh, look, Susan, look at the lion." I expect you've seen someone put a lighted match to a bit of newspaper, which is propped up on a grate against an unlit fire. Well, for a second, nothing seems to have happened. And then you notice a tiny streak of flame creeping along the edge of the newspaper. That was like that now. For a second after Aslan had breathed upon him, the stone lion looked just the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back, and then it spread to then the colors seemed to lick all over him like the flame licks all over the bit of the paper. Then, while his hindquarters were still obviously stone, the lion shook his mane and all of the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. Then he opened his great mouth, red mouth, warm and living, and gave a prodigious yawn. And now his hind legs had come to life. He lifted one of them and scratched himself, and then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding after him and frisking round him, whimpering with delight and jumping up to lick his face. Of course, the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so wonderful they soon forgot about him. Everywhere the statues were coming to life. The courtyard no longer looked like a museum, it looked like a zoo. Centaurs were running after Aslan and dancing around him until he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all that deadly white, the courtyard was now a blaze of colors, glossy chestnuts, sides of centaurs, the indigo horns of unicorns, the dazzling plumage of birds, the reddy brown of the foxes, dogs, and satyrs, the yellow stockings and crimson hoods of the dwarves, and the birch girls of silver, and the beech girls of fresh, transparent green, and the larch girls so green and bright it was almost a yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with the sound of happy roarings, brayings, yelpings, barkings, squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shouts, hurrahs, songs, and laughter. "Oh," said Susan in a different tone, "look, is it safe?" Lucy looked around and saw that Aslan had just breathed on the front of the feet of a stone giant. "It's all right," shouted Aslan joyously. "Once the feet are put right, the rest of him will follow." "That wasn't exactly what I meant," whispered Susan to Lucy, but it was too late to do anything about it now, even if Aslan would have listened to her. The change had already begun creeping from up the giant's legs, and now he was moving his feet. Can you see the giant? A moment later, he lifted the club off his shoulders, rubbed his eyes, and said, "Bless me, I must have been asleep. Now, where's that drowning little witch that was running around on the ground? Somewhere just by my feet it was." But then everyone had shouted up to him to explain what really happened. And when the giant put his hand to his ear and got them all to repeat it so he could hear it again, at last he understood. Then he bowed down until his head was no further off than the top of the haystack and touched his cap repeatedly to Aslan. Brimming over his honest, ugly face, giants of any sort are now so rare in England, and so few giants are good-tempered that 10 to 1 you never have seen a giant when his face is beaming. It's a sight well worth looking at. "Now, for the inside of the house," said Aslan. "Look alive, everyone, up the stairs and down the stairs and in my lady's chamber. Leave no corner unsearched. You never know when some poor prisoner might be concealed." And into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of their dark, horrible, furry, old castle echoed with the opening windows and everyone's voices crying out at once, "Don't forget the dungeons. Give us a hand with the door. Here's another little winding stair. Oh, I say, here's the poor kangaroo. Call Aslan. Phew, it smells in here. Look out for the trap doors up here. Look at the whole lot more on the landing." But the best of all was when Lucy came rushing upstairs and shouting, "Aslan, Aslan, I found Mr. Tumnus. Oh, do come quick." A moment later, Lucy and the little fawn were holding each other by both hands and dancing around and round for joy. The little chap was none the worse for having been a statue for what was, of course, and was very interested in all she had to tell him. But at last, the ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended. The whole castle stood empty with every door and window open and the light and the sweet spring air flooding into the all dark and evil places which needed them so badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard, and then someone, Tumnus, I think, first said, "But how are we going to get out?" For Aslan had not got in. And for Aslan had got in by jumping the gates that were still locked. "That'll be all right," said Aslan. And then, rising on his hind legs, he bawled up at the giant. "Hey, you up there," he roared. "What's your name?" "Giant Rumblebuffin, if you please, your honor," said the giant, once more touching his cap. "Well then, Giant Rumblebuffin," said Aslan, "just let us out of this, will you?" "Certainly, your honor. It'll be a pleasure," said Giant Rumblebuffin. "Stand well away from the gate, you little uns." And then he strode to the gate himself. And bang, bang, bang went his huge club. The gates creaked at the first blow, cracked at the second, and shivered at the third. Then he tackled the towers on each side of them, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both the towers and a good bit of the wall on each side went thundering down into a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust had cleared, it was odd, standing in that dry, grim, stony yard, to see the gap in the grass and the waving trees and sparkling streams of the forest, and the blue hills beyond, and beyond that, the sky. "Blowed if I ain't all in muck and sweat," said the giant, puffing like the largest railway engine. "Comes out of being out of condition. I suppose neither you nor the young ladies have such a thing as a pocket kerchief about you." "Yes, I have," said Lucy, standing on tiptoes and holding her handkerchief up as far as she could reach. "Thank you, missy," said Giant Rumblebuffin, stooping down. Next moment, Lucy got rather a fright, for she found herself caught up in midair between the giant's finger and thumb. But just as she was getting near his face and he suddenly started and then put her gently back on the ground, muttering, "Bless me, I've picked up the little girl instead. I beg your pardon, missy, I thought you was the handkerchief." "No, no," said Lucy, laughing, "here it is." This time he managed to get it, but only as it was about the same size to him as a saccharin tablet would be to you. So thus, when she saw him solemnly rubbing it to and fro across his giant red face, she said, "I'm afraid it's not much use to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin." "Not at all, not at all," said the giant politely. "Never met a nicer handkerchief. So fine, so handy, so I don't know how to describe it." "What a nice giant he is," said Lucy to Mr. Tumnus. "Oh yes," replied the fawn. "All the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all the giant families in Narnia. Not very clever, perhaps. I never knew a giant that was, but an odd family and with traditions, you know. If he'd been of the other sort, she'd never have turned him into stone." At this point, Aslan clapped his paws together and called for silence. "Our day's work is not yet over," he said. "And if the witch is to be finally defeated before bedtime, we must find the battle at once." "And join in, I hope, sir," said the largest of the centaurs. "Of course," said Aslan. "And now those who can keep up, that is, children, dwarfs, and small animals, can't keep up. Children, dwarf, and small animals must ride on the backs of those who can. That is, lions, centaurs, unicorns, horses, giants, and eagles. Those who are good with their noses must come out in front with us lions to smell out where the battle is. Look lively and sort yourselves." And with a great deal of bustle and cheering, they did. The most pleased of the lot was the other lion, who kept running about everywhere, pretending to be busy, but really in order to order everyone he met. Did you hear what he said? Us lions. That means him and me. Us lions. That is what I like about Aslan. No standoffishness, just us lions. That meant him and me. At least he went on saying this until Aslan had loaded him up with 3 dwarves, 1 dryad, 2 rabbits, and a hedgehog. That steadied him a bit. When all were ready, and it was a big sheepdog who actually helped Aslan most in getting them sorted into their proper order, they set out through a gap in the castle wall. At first, the lion and dogs were nosing about in all directions, but suddenly one great hound picked up the scent and gave a bay. There was no time lost after that. Soon all the dogs and lions and wolves and other hunting animals were going at full speed with their noses to the ground, and all the others, streaked out for about half a mile behind them, were following as fast as they could. The noise was like an English fox hunt, only better, because every now and then, with the music of the hounds, was the mixed roar of the other lion, and sometimes a far deeper, more awful roar of Aslan himself. Faster and faster they went. As the scent became easier and easier to follow. And then, just as they came to the last curve in the narrow winding valley, Lucy heard above all those noises another noise, a different one, which gave her a queer feeling inside. It was the noise of shouts and shrieks and the clashing of metal against metal. They came out of the narrow valley, and at once she saw the reason. There stood Peter and Edmund and all the rest of Aslan's army, fighting desperately against the crowd of horrible creatures whom she had seen last night. Only now, in the daylight, they looked even stranger and more evil and even more deformed. There also seemed to be far more of them. Peter's army, which had their backs to her, looked terribly few. And there were statues dotted all over the battlefield. So apparently the witch had been using her wand, but she didn't seem to be using it now. She was fighting with her stone knife. It was Peter she was fighting, both of them going at it so hard Lucy could hardly make out what was happening. You see the pictures? She only saw the stone knife and Peter's sword flashing so quickly that they looked like 3 knives and 3 swords. That pair were in the center. On each side of the line, stretched out, horrible things were happening wherever she looked. Off my back, children, shouted Aslan, and they both tumbled off. And then, with a roar that shook all Narnia from the western lamppost to the shores of the eastern sea, the great beast flung himself upon the white witch. Lucy saw her face lifted toward him for 1 second with an expression of terror and amazement. Then lion and witch had rolled over together, but with the witch underneath. And at the same moment, all warlike creatures whom Aslan had led from the witch's house rushed madly onto the enemy lines. Dwarves with their battle axes, dogs with their teeth, giant with his club and his feet also crushed dozens of foe. Unicorns with their horns, centaurs with swords and hooves, and Peter, his tired army, cheered, and the newcomers roared, and the enemy squealed and gibbered till the wood re-echoed with the din of that onset. And that's the end of chapter 16.